This channel is part of the History Hit network.
A bitter fight for the succession to the throne of the Frankish kingdom broke out between Charlemagne and his younger brother Carloman in the 8th century.
Gebe vor allem auf unsere beiden Söhne Acht und hüte dich vor meinem Bruder. Du darfst nicht zulassen, dass er ihnen die Krone entreißt.
After Carloman's death, Charlemagne proclaimed himself sole ruler, but the widow of his deceased brother fled with her sons across the Alps to the Lombard court. There, King Desiderius turned to the Pope.
Salbt jene Knaben zu den rechtmäßigen Thronfolgern Karlmanns. Sie sind seine Söhne.
Ich werde darüber befinden. Doch solch ein Urteil braucht Zeit.
Wir brauchen keinen Krieg, sondern Allianzen.
Der Krieg, Mutter, hat schon längst begonnen.
Was soll das also bedeuten, Karl?
Das bedeutet, dass ich als König aller Franken von nun an meine Entscheidungen alleine treffen werde. Und du wirst nicht mehr mitentscheiden.
Charlemagne broke with his mother Bertrada and prepared for war with the Lombards, but he knew that he needed the support of the Frankish princes. In the military camp, he made a decision that surprised everyone.
Aber die Langobarden sollen uns jetzt nicht kümmern. Kümmern wir uns lieber um die Sachsen.
The war against the Saxons was intended to earn the Franks easy plunder.
A king at this time always had to be at war. Waging war is his main business.
Charlemagne's fearsome riders attacked the Saxon settlements. Plundering and murdering, they scoured the country. The war was waged with the utmost severity. The Franks showed no mercy. But the Saxon resistance grew. Contrary to his hopes, Charlemagne wasn't able to secure a quick victory. He searched for a solution and altered his strategy. During his military campaign, Charlemagne reached the Saxons' most sacred site, the legendary Irminsul, a potent tree which, according to their beliefs, bore the weight of the entire universe.
Bringt die Fackeln.
Mein König, mit Verlaub, diese Stele ist das höchste Heiligtum der Sachsen. Die Irminsul ist die direkte Verbindung zu ihren Göttern. Sie ist keine kleine, von Menschen erbaute Kirche, die wieder aufgerichtet werden kann.
Every war had to be legitimized, and the destruction of the heathen object of worship helped a great deal with the legitimation strategy. Charlemagne's concept right from the start was to weaken paganism, to exterminate paganism, and introduce Christian altars, Christian churches, and Christian religious organizations into the country. This quick victory and the quick conquest of Irminsul helped him with that, of course.
If you love history then you'll love History Hit. We have tons of exclusive documentaries about the most important people in history that you will not find anywhere else. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Janega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. And it's not just documentaries either. We have a network of incredible history podcasts bringing you new episodes every day. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
Brennt sie nieder.
Right from the start, Charlemagne's campaign against the Saxons was also motivated by acquiring booty, to boost the mood of his warriors and princes. He found a secret sacrificial cave in the Saxon forests.
What the Franks well knew was the shrine of the Saxons, where you would get a large amount of gold and silver. Charlemagne needed a quick injection of loot, of plunder, in 772 because he was trying to build up his own power with a view to getting his nephews back from Lombardy. Everywhere was always connected. These different theatres of war were always connected.
At the same time, far away from Saxony, Pope Adrian made a far-reaching decision.
König Desiderius, ihr kamt zu mir mit der Bitte, die Söhne des verschiedenen Karlmanns als seine Nachfolger zu fränkischen Königen zu salben. Nach reiflicher Prüfung sind wir zu der Überzeugung gelangt, so wahr uns Gott helfe, dass die Krone über das Reich Karlmanns nur einen rechtmäßigen Erben haben kann, König Karl. Wie wir Sachsen hören, führt er das Schwert Gottes wie kein Zweiter.
Und dennoch ist König Karl ein Thronräuber, Eure Heiligkeit. Seid ihr euch eurer Entscheidung sicher? Auch im Hinblick auf die Sicherheit Roms.
Wollt ihr mir etwa drohen, lieber Desiderius? Mein Entschluss ist unumkehrbar.
Meister, stimmen denn die Berichte, dass Desiderius in seinem Zorn sogar Rom angegriffen hat? Meister? Meister? Meister?
Ja. Papst Hadrian war schwer in die Enge getrieben. Er hat Desiderius mit dem Kirchenbann gedroht, aber das half nichts. In seiner Not hat er König Karl um Hilfe gebeten. Notiere, Johannes. Schon Karls Vater Pippin hatte auf Gesuch des Papstes einen Feldzug gegen die Langobarden unternommen. Nun hatte Karl zur Kriegserklärung den gleichen Grund. Allerdings war der jetzige Feldzug mit größeren Schwierigkeiten verbunden und nahm auch einen anderen Ausgang.
It's likely that in 773-774, the decision to pursue the Lombards was by no means unanimous. Charlemagne's sister-in-law, Carloman's widow, was in Lombard kingdom with her children, and they must have had a certain following among important Franks. I would say the war against the Lombards would have required more groundwork among the Franks than a summer campaign against the Saxons, which could be started relatively risk-free.
Mein König, verzeiht. Ich bin gerade erst unterrichtet worden, dass ihr hier seid.
Ich kam auch unangekündigt.
Was verschafft uns die Ehre eures Besuches? Ihr habt Fragen.
Ihr könnt gut in der Seele eines Menschen lesen.
Nun, seit der Beisetzung eures Vaters wart ihr nicht mehr hier. Und nun, da ein Krieg ins Haus steht, sucht ihr diesen Ort auf. Da muss man nicht viel lesen können in der Seele eines Sohnes. Eure Situation ist wirklich äußerst kompliziert. Schon euer Vater hat die Gunst vieler Fürsten verloren, als er gegen die Langobarden zog.
Aber er hat den Feldzug gewonnen.
Euer Vater hatte keinen konkurrierenden Thronfolger am Tisch der Langobarden sitzen. Die Söhne eures Bruders haben hierzulande viele Freunde.
Ich hätte sie gar nicht außer Landes lassen dürfen.
Gott wird deine Milde lohnen, mein Sohn.
Aber ich kann Desiderius nicht einfach so gewähren lassen. Das wäre ein fatales Zeichen meiner Schwäche.
Ja, ihr müsst Wohltaten folgen lassen. Das ist wohl wahr. Aber wählt eure Taten mit Bedacht. Nutzt die Schwäche eures Feindes. Desiderius ist wahrlich nicht dumm, aber man sagt, er sei über alle Maßen selbstverliebt. Spielt mit seiner Überheblichkeit. Schickt eure Armee über die Alpen und dann verhandelt mit Desiderius.
Verhandeln?
Gebt ihm das Gefühl, ihr hättet Angst vor ihm. Tut so, als ob ihr eine Schlacht unbedingt vermeiden wollt. Dann wird er Fehler machen. Glaubt mir. Nichts ist wirksamer, als dem Feind Schwäche vorzuspielen.
Und was ist mit unseren wankelmütigen Fürsten?
Nun, für einen Feldzug, bei dem kein Langobardenblut vergossen werden soll, für einen solchen Feldzug werdet ihr genug Fürsten finden. Und wenn ihr erst einmal unterwegs seid und Desiderius eure Friedensangebote ausschlägt, dann ist vieles möglich.
Ihr hättet wahrlich Feldherr werden sollen.
Feldherr oder Waffe, beide führen wir Menschen in die Schlacht. Nur dass sich die Schlachten ein wenig unterscheiden.
By the summer of 773, the military campaign against the Lombards was agreed. Charlemagne crossed the Alps in two separate formations. He sent one down the Aosta Valley, while leading the other personally across Mont Cenis. The two armies were to join to the west of Turin in the Susa Valley. That was the plan. The army numbered more than 3,000 men. The regular soldiers were joined by around 1,000 courtiers. Early medieval vehicles had no suspension. They were just simple carts, and they were just for women and children. That meant a significant exertion for Queen Hildegard. It was important to Charlemagne that she accompany him, and she followed him on his Italian campaign, highly pregnant and in freezing temperatures across the Alps.
Hildegard couldn't have had an easy life at Charlemagne's side because he always wanted her to accompany him, so that she was with him on most of the campaigns, even though she was usually pregnant. First, she was there on the Lombard campaign to Pavia. She followed Charlemagne across the Alps in winter, together with her eldest son and her stepson, Pepin.
Ihrem ältesten Sohn und ihrem Stiefsohn Pepin.
Crossing the Alps was a life-threatening adventure in the early Middle Ages, especially when snow and ice blocked the way in the wintertime. According to legend, only a miracle saved the Franks from certain death after bad weather took them by surprise. A further legend recounts that Charlemagne had a church built out of gratitude for his miraculous survival in the dangerous gorges. The small church of St. Benedict in Mael Venosta is one of the few surviving monuments from the Carolingian era. Its donor had himself immortalized in a fresco. That's the only way we know what Frankish nobleman wore. He's holding a richly adorned sword in front of his body. Much speculation has gone into his identity. The suggestions range from a nobleman in the king's entourage all the way to Charlemagne's son, Pepin. The march across the Alps took weeks. As expected, Desiderius rejected an offer of peace. Charlemagne's plan seemed to be working, and his warriors had a strategy.
During the Lombard campaign, the first problem was circumventing the famous chasms. There are sources claiming that one Frankish regiment went around the chasms to attack the Lombards from behind. Charlemagne's quick invasion of northern Italy can only be explained by assuming he got some of Desiderius's followers onto his side. He could have bribed them, or it was all to do with his strategic skills.
Vielleicht lag es aber auch an seinem strategischen Geschick.
The Lombards wanted to attack the Franks in the gorge from above. They had no idea that a second Frankish contingent would attack them from behind over the mountain ridges. Taken by surprise, Desiderius had to flee with his army behind the high walls of his capital, Pavia. In awe, a chronicler later reported the arrival of the Frankish army at Pavia. Finally, the Iron Charlemagne himself appeared. The iron filled the entire plain and threw back the shine of the sun. But the Lombards didn't surrender, and finally Charlemagne decided to besiege Pavia, a daring undertaking so close to winter with an uncertain outcome.
He must have planned such a siege right from the start, because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. A siege takes a long time, 3/4 of a year, over winter. It started in September and ended in June. That means he had to make logistical and technical preparations.
To keep his nobility in good spirits, Charlemagne frequently put on parties in the wintry encampment.
Ja, komm her.
Eure Schwester hat Fieber.
Und wann kommt das Kind?
Gott allein befindet darüber, wann das Kind zur Welt kommen wird.
Mach dir nicht so viele Sorgen um mich, Bruder. Mir geht's gut.
Du solltest nicht hier sein.
Ich bin die Königin. Es ist meine Pflicht, an der Seite meines Gemahls zu sein.
Wir sollten alle nicht hier sein.
Teurer Schwager, was lässt dich so ungehalten unsere Feier stören?
Mein König, für die Kirche und den Papst eine Schlacht zu schlagen, gibt euch noch lange nicht das Recht, der Sünde zu frönen.
Klingt aus.
Nur ein guter Christ wird diese Schlacht gewinnen. Und ich vermag keinen hier zu sehen. Während ihr euch hier vergnügt, gebärt meine Schwester euch unter Schmerzen im Nachbarzelt ein Kind.
Übertreib es nicht, Schwager. Sei kein Spielverderber. Trink einen Becher mit uns.
There's an English proverb, there's no smoke without fire. I think in this case that contemporaries were surprised at the number of mistresses that he had. And you don't have to wait for even 10 years after his death before there are rumours that Charlemagne is in hell having a bad time, specifically having his genitals gnawed at by a beast to punish him for, well, it's fairly obvious what he's being punished for.
The Siege of Pavia went on without progress. Then Charlemagne surprisingly went to Rome to have an audience with the Pope. It was the first time he'd seen the Holy City.
Es gab sicherlich von Seiten Karls eine...
Charlemagne will have been excited to see what this city looked like, because we know from the early Middle Ages that the people from the north were really interested and excited to travel to Rome because of the large stone buildings they'd heard of and that they didn't have back home.
Große Steinbauten, wie sie aus ihrer Heimat sie überhaupt nicht kennen.
Pope Adrian I must have been surprised by Charlemagne's visit, according to the sources, and even more surprised by how humbly and deeply moved the King of the Franks behaved.
Charles needed something like a miracle. And he appears in Rome, and Charlemagne slowly ascending, kissing the steps as he goes up, and then embracing the Pope and leading him, his left hand in the Pope's right hand, leading him into St. Peter's. I think that this must have been an extraordinarily powerful experience, and that then going into the shrine of St. Peter, feeling the spiritual power, the heat of the shrine, if you like, was something that he would never have forgotten.
Charlemagne wanted the papal blessing for his Lombard campaign, and he delved deep into his pockets to get it. Following the tradition started by his father, he presented himself as the patron of the church and renewed a generous promise of a donation.
A major reason for his visit to Rome was that Charlemagne wanted to request the support of Saint Peter and his successor for his military action against the Lombards. That's the only explanation for why he was willing to give this, at least temporary, promise of a donation, to give the conquered territories that had belonged to the Lombards until then to Saint Peter.
Als Eigentum übergeben werden sollen.
When Charlemagne returned, plagues and famine had forced Pavia to capitulate.
Gelobt sei Jesus Christus.
Und alle Heiligen dazu.
Siehst du, Gerold? Nun waren doch wir die besseren Christen.
In der Tat, mein König. In der Tat.
I think for Charles, this encounter with the saint was the miracle. And it enabled him to go back and finish the war. In real life, what really enabled him to finish the war was that a terrible plague broke out in Pavia and the Lombards were decimated by illness. But in his mind, he had formed this protective relationship. He protected St. Peter and his lands, but St. Peter was his protector from now on. And every subsequent triumph in his reign, I think, was a vindication of that belief.
Karl ließ nicht locker, bis Desiderius durch eine lange Belagerung gezwungen hatte, sich bedingungslos zu unterwerfen.
Und was wurde aus König Desiderius?
Sei nicht so ungeduldig, Johannes. Schreib weiter. Der langobardische Feldzug endete also mit der Unterwerfung Italiens, der lebenslangen Verbannung des Königs Desiderius, der Vertreibung seines Sohnes Adalgis aus Italien und der Rückgabe der von den langobardischen Königen geraubten Güter an Hadrian, den Papst der römischen Kirche.
Gerberga and her sons, the rightful successors to Charlemagne, fell into Charlemagne's hands as a result of the Lombard defeat. Frankish soldiers led them off into exile.
Historians can ponder what happened to these two boys, Charlemagne's nephews. Since we have no record of what happened, it's likely that Charlemagne wanted and accelerated their deaths. We don't have proof of this. The Carolingians, unlike the Merovingians, tended not to kill their enemies anymore, but it can't fully be ruled out.
Aber ganz auszuschließen ist es auch nicht.
Charlemagne had been successful. From that point on, he was allowed to style himself Rex Francorum et Langobardorum, King of the Franks and the Lombards. As a result, he controlled the whole of Western Europe, but he was still a far cry from peace.
Mein König, die Sachsen haben sich unter der Führung Widukinds erhoben. Überall wurden christliche Kirchen niedergebrannt.
Meine Krone.
After the victory over the Lombards, Charlemagne turned his attention to Saxony again. He acted in a new way. He was so brutal that the Anglo-Saxons believed he had lost his mind. This shows that maybe Charlemagne couldn't cope as well with setbacks as one might believe from Einhard's account.
Wie man das vielleicht nach den Ausführungen Einhards glauben mag.
Charlemagne's counterattack was relentless and cruel. The warriors under the Saxon leader Widukind didn't stand a chance against the superior Frankish forces.
Gott sei meiner armselig gnädig. Wasche mich rein von meiner Missetat. Reinige meine Seele.
Charles certainly wanted to convert the Saxons to Christianity. He was serious about that. And part of that package was that they would swear oaths of loyalty to him. And once they'd sworn those oaths, if they then rebelled, they were regarded as perjurers and traitors. And so any kind of retaliation was justified. And some pretty horrible things happened. But I think in Charles's mind and in the mind of contemporaries that breaking your oath to the king was something that you just couldn't do.
Charlemagne's bitterest enemy was the Saxon leader Widukind.
Bei allen Göttern schwöre ich, Widukind. Das räche ich.
Widukind, who became Charlemagne's great enemy for a few years, was a Westphalian nobleman by origin, who became the driving force of the resistance to the Franks from 778 onwards. Widukind went a little bit against his aristocratic peers, who came to arrangements with Charlemagne quite easily. So he became the leader of the middle and lower classes among the Saxons. If he had been successful, then he could have founded a Saxon kingdom.
Dann hätte er ein sächsisches Königtum begründen können.
Kennst du das Sprichwort, das die Griechen geprägt haben? Der Franke soll dein Freund, aber nicht dein Nachbar sein. Vor der Stärke und Entschlossenheit des großen Karl zitterten damals alle. Und zu Recht. Als er nach den Langobarden die Sachsen besiegt hatte, stürzte er sich umgehend in das nächste Abenteuer. 30 Jahre wird das so weitergehen. Und er wird fast ununterbrochen Krieg führen. Aber jetzt genug davon. Lass uns zum Gastmahl bei unserem Freund Absantor aufbrechen. Ich habe Hunger.
Ja, ich auch.
Confident of certain victory against the Saxons, Charlemagne went to the winter camp.
Hör zu, mein getreuer Roland. Zeig, was du kannst. Du bist mein bester Krieger. Mein Glücksbringer. Hä?
Mein König, alle wissen, dass ihr unbesiegbar seid. Lasst Gnade walten.
Was ist los? Hast du keinen Mumm? Hat der Krieg dich weich gemacht? Bist du ein Schwächling?
Du siehst müde aus.
Mir wurde die Bitte vorgetragen, den Statthalter von Saragossa im Kampf gegen den Emir zu unterstützen.
Ein Feldzug gegen den Emir von Cordoba.
Saragossa will unabhängig werden. Der Statthalter wird mir die Stadttore öffnen. Und ich werde im Kampf den Sieg davontragen.
Karl, deine Untertanen, deine Krieger, selbst deine Fürsten. Sie alle sind des Krieges müde und mit Verlaub. Ich bin es auch.
Around 1,700 kilometers separate Saragossa from Paderborn. Adding up the distances covered on the way to his military campaigns and royal palaces, Charlemagne will have ridden around the globe more than once in his lifetime.
Medieval rulers were always on the move because the communications at the time meant that the ruler had to show himself in the different regions of his kingdom in order to be taken note of. That was the case during the first half of Charlemagne's reign. He also had military considerations, and in such a kingdom you had to expect that a peaceful journey would turn into a punitive expedition against someone who had to be brought to reason.
Den man zur Raison bringen wollte.
Ich bin am Ende meiner Kräfte. Aber ich sorge mich vor allem um dich. Karl, du hast dich so verändert. Der Karl, der mich geheiratet hat, war, weiß Gott, kein zahmes Lamm. Aber er war nicht blind vor Schlachtengier und er wäre nicht in diesen ungewissen Krieg gezogen.
Liebste Hildegard, ich habe keine andere Wahl. Und ich gehe im Namen des Herrn.
Ich bitte dich, hör auf mich, kehr um.
Gott wird mich schützen. Du brauchst mich nicht weiter zu begleiten. Ich lasse dir ein paar Soldaten zu deinem Schutz für die Rückreise.
When Charlemagne finally reached Saragossa, the situation there had changed completely. The governor who'd asked him for help against the Emir of Cordoba had been deposed. The city gates remained closed to the Franks. Charlemagne refused to give up. He besieged Saragossa for months, but to no avail. It was the first defeat of his military career.
Es ist wahr, die Soldaten sind schwach. Seit Wochen gibt es nicht mehr genug Proviant und Wasser. Viele sind bereits erkrankt und ein Aufruhr ist nicht mehr...
Schweigt, Markgraf Roland! Was erlaubt ihr euch?
Ist die Lage wirklich so aussichtslos?
All unser Proviant ist aufgebraucht und auch in der Umgebung ist nichts mehr zu holen. Selbst eure Fürsten sehen keine Möglichkeit mehr, die Belagerung weiter aufrechtzuerhalten.
Ich danke dir für deine Offenheit, mein Freund. Aber sag mir, wo ist mein Glück geblieben? Verkündet für morgen den Rückzug. Ihr, Roland, werdet auf unserem Marsch die Nachhut sichern.
On his return from Spain, Charlemagne gave an order with major consequences. He attacked Christian Pamplona and allowed it to be plundered. With his brutal assault on the Basques, Charlemagne triggered a retaliatory attack. Basque warriors attacked the Frankish rearguard in the Pyrenees and killed them all. For Charlemagne, the death of Margrave Roland marked the bitter end of his Spain adventure.
The attack on the Basques was an attack on Christians. They presumably avenged themselves because Charlemagne, after having failed in Saragossa, plundered Pamplona on his return. That was a terrible thing to do. He plundered a Christian city and the Basques sought revenge.
A contemporary said that this was a terrible defeat, that it cast a terrible cloud over his soul from which he could never recover. Why was that so? I think he lost the plunder which had been captured in these cities, and that was, in a sense, the economic point of the campaign. But even more important, some of his closest companions, of whom one was Roland, had been killed. And I think for Charles that was a terrible loss of face, loss of honour, that his closest men, the ones he trusted, they died for him.
Der Spanienfeldzug, das bleibt unter uns, war ein Debakel. Hat man je von Fehltritten römischer Cäsaren gelesen? Nein. Und auch ich werde nichts dergleichen tun. Niemand ist unfehlbar, Johannes. Auch der christlichste aller Herrscher, unser hochverehrter König Karl, nicht. Und meine Aufgabe ist es doch, der Nachwelt sein Leben als Vorbild zu hinterlassen. Ich werde also schreiben. König Karl überquerte die Pyrenäen und eroberte alle Städte und Burgen, die er belagerte. Dann kehrte er ohne Verluste um. Auf dem Rückmarsch musste er allerdings doch noch die Treulosigkeit der Basken erleben.
Einhard
will have intended to report Charlemagne's life accurately. I don't know any issue where scholars today could say, that's not true, that's a lie. But like everyone who writes about history, he selected the material the way he wanted to present it.
Hat den Stoff natürlich so ausgewählt, wie ihn darbieten wollte.
He understandably tended to portray Charlemagne in as good a light as possible.
Günstiges Licht zu rücken. Hat eine gewisse Verehrung für Karl den Großen.
He venerated Charlemagne, and that guided him. But there are no breaches of truth.
Die Wahrheit gibt es nicht.
Charlemagne's defeat in the Spanish campaign wasn't just kept quiet or reinterpreted by Einhard. Others even turned the ignominy he suffered in the Pyrenees into a hero's epic. One example of that is the Song of Roland. The 13th century Stricker manuscript, now kept in St. Gallen in Switzerland, illustrates the story. The precious miniatures depict the events like in a picture book. Margrave Roland's horn Oliphant, with which he desperately wanted to get Charlemagne's help, became legendary. But all help came too late, and the king was only able to mourn the death of his friend. The oldest and most important written version of the Song of Roland is in the 12th century Oxford manuscript. It's the original text of the famous epic. Dr. Wolf Steinsieg has translated it from Old French and interpreted it.
Charlemagne isn't a shining hero in The Song of Roland. The text says he's a 200-year-old ruler surrounded by young, dynamic princes. It says he kept getting into difficult situations where he got frustrated and cried and was in despair. Then he turned to God and got help. The Song of Roland ends, "How laborious my life is." So he's no shining hero. The entire text is a heroic song, the victory of Christianity over the unbelievers, and the victory of the loyal over the traitor.
While Charlemagne was still on his return from Spain, a new rebellion erupted in Saxony. This time, the guerrilla fighters under the Saxon prince Widukind defeated the Frankish occupiers. Widukind increasingly became Charlemagne's nightmare.
Kein anderer Krieg ist von den Franken mit ähnlicher Ausdauer, Erbitterung und Mühe geführt worden wie dieser. Er hätte zweifellos früher beigelegt werden können, wenn dies bei der Treulosigkeit der Sachsen möglich gewesen wäre.
Nur zu, Meister Johannes. Sprecht ruhig weiter.
Es lässt sich kaum beschreiben, wie oft die Sachsen besiegt wurden und sich flehentlich dem König unterwarfen, wie oft sie Gehorsam versprachen, gelobten, den Götzendienst aufzugeben und das Christentum anzunehmen. Doch hatten sie es meist auch ebenso eilig, das Versprochene nicht zu halten. Hier waren wir stehen geblieben.
Dann schreibt weiter. In diesem Krieg fielen zahlreiche fränkische und sächsische Adelige, darunter die höchsten Würdenträger.
Todesstrafe erleidet der, der nach heidnischem Brauch Leichen bestattet, indem er den Körper den Flammen preisgibt. Sterben soll, wer einen Menschen dem Teufel opfert und nach heidnischer Sitte den Götzen als Opfer darbringt.
Sterben soll, wer gewaltsam eine Kirche erstürmt oder in Flammen aufgehen lässt. Sterben soll, wer einen Bischof, einen Priester oder einen Diakon tötet.
Karl der Große sah sich nach der Niederlage des
After the defeat by the Saxons in 782, Charlemagne was confronted with a big problem. Many Franks had fallen, and he now faced pressure to legitimize what he was doing. When he did achieve a victory, he took the very draconian measure, allegedly, of having 4,500 Saxons put to death.
4,500 Sachsen hinrichten.
Charlemagne made an example of hitherto unparalleled ruthlessness. He forced the surrender of Saxon leaders, then had them beheaded and thrown into the river Aller in the town of Verden.
Ob es 4.500 gewesen sind,
A difficult passage in the kingdom's annals states that it was 4,500. But that's doubtful, because it's really a very large number. And we've seen that medieval sources exaggerate the figures in military events.
Übertriebene Zahlen genannt werden.
But it can't be denied that such a bloodbath took place, and that the number of victims must have been significant.
Von Opfern gegeben hat.
Willst du dein Leben retten? Dann sag mir, wo ist euer Anführer? Wo ist Widukind? Schert!
Charlemagne considered Widukind a big problem. Widukind kept waging war successfully against the Franks, but whenever Charlemagne himself showed up, Widukind withdrew from further confrontations. This behavior will have impacted on Charlemagne personally. He felt challenged and insulted.
Durch diese Art der Kriegsführung.
Charlemagne still hadn't found a way of breaking the tough resistance of the Saxons.